The night shift workers at the Krupp steel foundry could hear it first, a distant mechanical hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Heinrich Müller, a 53-year-old foreman who had spent 30 years pouring molten steel into shell casings, paused mid-step on the factory floor. The sound was different from the constant thunder of the furnaces, different from the railway engines that hauled coal and iron ore through the valley. This was something that came from above. He looked up through the grimy skylights, and in that moment before the sirens began their wail, he saw them. Dozens of black shapes moving across the face of the moon, their wings reflecting the searchlights that now clawed desperately at the sky. The Americans had come to the Ruhr. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had assured the German people that their industrial heartland was invincible. The Ruhr Valley, that dense concentration of factories, foundries, and coal mines stretching across western Germany, produced more than 60% of the Reich's steel, nearly 80% of its coal, and countless tons of ammunition, tanks, and artillery pieces. Joseph Goebbels himself had stood before newsreel cameras and declared that the combined industrial might of the Ruhr made Germany unstoppable, that the smokestacks of Essen, Dortmund, and Duisburg were monuments to Aryan superiority. The workers who lived in the cramped apartments beneath those smokestacks believed it. They had to believe it. Their sons were dying on the Eastern Front. Their rations were growing smaller each month, but at least they had this, the certainty that their labor, their sacrifice, was feeding an unbreakable war machine. The American 8th Air Force had other plans. When the first B-17 flying fortresses appeared over the Ruhr in early 1943, they came not as raiders, but as executioners. These were not the scattered, almost experimental bombing runs of 1942, when American crews were still learning the brutal mathematics of daylight precision bombing. By March of 1943, the Americans had refined their doctrine into something terrifyingly systematic. They called it strategic bombing, a clinical term that concealed the firestorms, the collapsing buildings, the workers buried alive beneath tons of molten metal and broken machinery. The targeting lists prepared by analysts in England were exhaustive, factory by factory, foundry by foundry, power station by power station. The Americans had studied the Ruhr the way a surgeon studies an anatomy chart, identifying every vital organ, every critical artery, and now they had come to operate. The German defenders had expected confidence from the Americans, the brash certainty of a nation that had never been bombed, never been invaded, never watched its cities burn. What they encountered instead was something more unsettling, a kind of mechanical determination that seemed almost inhuman in its precision. The bomber formations flew in tight defensive boxes, each aircraft positioned to provide covering fire for the others. When German fighters tore into these formations, the Americans did not scatter or panic. They held formation. They watched their comrades' planes explode or spiral down in flames, and they held formation. When flak shells burst around them, filling the air with jagged metal fragments that could shred an aircraft's aluminum skin like paper, they held formation. This was not the desperate courage of men fighting for survival. This was something else entirely, a terrible industrial patience that mirrored the very factories they had come to destroy. The Krupp works in Essen became the focal point of this new American campaign. Alfred Krupp, the dynasty's latest inheritor, had built an empire on steel and blood. For over a century, the Krupp name had been synonymous with German military power. Their cannons had bombarded Paris in 1871. Their artillery had pounded Verdun in 1916. Their tanks now rolled across the steppes of Russia. The main factory complex in Essen sprawled across hundreds of acres, a maze of blast furnaces, rolling mills, and assembly halls connected by miles of railway track. At peak production, it employed over 100,000 workers, many of them slave laborers dragged from occupied territories. The complex was so vast, so essential to the German war effort, that Krupp himself had boasted it could never be effectively bombed. There's simply too many buildings, too many redundant systems, too much sheer industrial mass to cripple with aerial bombardment.
The Americans proved him wrong with mathematics and high explosives. On the night of March 5, 1943, 442 British bombers struck Essen in a devastating night raid, guided by new Pathfinder techniques that allowed them to mark targets with unprecedented accuracy. The fires were still burning when the Americans arrived the next morning. Flying at 25,000 feet through a sky dark with anti-aircraft fire, the B-17 crews released their payloads with the cold precision their doctrine demanded. Each bombardier had been trained to identify his target through the Norden bomb sight, that miraculous device that promised to put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality was messier. Smoke, clouds, and defensive fire made precision difficult, but the sheer weight of explosives compensated for individual inaccuracy. 1,000-pound bombs crashed through factory roofs, detonating among the furnaces and machinery below. The explosions triggered secondary fires as coal dust ignited, as oil reservoirs burst, as chemical stores went up in toxic clouds. Heinrich Müller survived that first raid by taking shelter in a reinforced basement bunker. When he emerged 6 hours later, the factory floor where he had worked for 3 decades no longer existed. The building's steel framework stood like a blackened skeleton against the dawn sky, but everything else, the machinery, the raw materials, the half-finished shell casings, had been obliterated or melted into twisted sculptures of metal. He walked through the ruins in a daze, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered brick. The smell was overwhelming: burning coal, scorched metal, and beneath it all something organic and terrible that he tried not to think about. This was not the clean, heroic warfare depicted in the newsreels. This was industrial murder, systematic and remorseless. The German authorities attempted to maintain the fiction of invulnerability. Radio broadcasts assured the population that the damage was minimal, that production would resume within days, that the American terror bombers were being shot down in droves. Some of this was true. The 8th Air Force was indeed suffering catastrophic losses, sometimes losing 10% or more of the aircraft dispatched on a single mission. But the Americans kept coming. That was what the German people couldn't understand, what their leaders had never prepared them for, the sheer abundance that allowed the Americans to absorb such losses and return again and again. For every B-17 shot down over the Ruhr, 2 more rolled off assembly lines in Seattle or Long Beach. For every crew killed, a dozen more graduates emerged from training programs in Texas and Arizona. The Americans were fighting an industrial war with industrial methods, and they had far more industry to draw upon. The workers of the Ruhr began to understand this during the spring of 1943, as the raids continued with clockwork regularity. Every few days the sirens would sound, the formations would appear, and more factories would be reduced to rubble. The Nazi Party organized cleanup crews, impressed civilians into forced labor to clear debris and restore production. Women and teenagers worked alongside prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, all of them hauling broken machinery and twisted girders under the watchful eyes of SS guards. The Americans had a term for this: area bombing, the deliberate targeting of entire industrial districts to destroy not just the factories themselves, but the infrastructure that supported them, the power plants, the rail yards, the workers' housing. It was brutal calculus: kill the workers or make their work impossible, and the weapons cannot be built. In May of 1943, the Möhne and Ader dams were breached by British bombers using specially designed bouncing bombs, releasing millions of tons of water that flooded the Ruhr Valley below. Factories were inundated, hydroelectric plants were destroyed, and the vital water supply for cooling industrial machinery was disrupted for months. This raid, more than any other, shattered the myth of German industrial invincibility. If the Allies could breach massive concrete dams built into mountainsides, what couldn't they destroy? The psychological impact rippled through the civilian population. Trust in the regime's promises began to erode. The official propaganda grew shriller, more desperate, even as the reality on the ground became impossible to deny.
The Americans who flew these missions understood what they were doing. They were not naive about the human cost of strategic bombing. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, a B-17 pilot who flew 25 missions over Germany, later wrote, "We knew there were people down there, workers, families, children, but we also knew what those factories were producing, the tanks that were killing our guys in North Africa, the submarines that were sinking our merchant ships, the ammunition that was being used against the Russians. We didn't hate the German people, we hated what they were building." This was the terrible logic of total war. The factory worker became as legitimate a target as the soldier because in a modern industrial conflict, they were equally essential to the war effort. By summer of 1943, the Krupp works operated at less than 40% capacity. The great blast furnaces stood cold and silent, their brick linings cracked beyond repair. Railway bridges lay in the rivers they once crossed. Power stations operated sporadically, if at all. The Germans attempted to disperse production, moving machinery to smaller facilities scattered across the countryside, even hiding some operations in salt mines and tunnels. But dispersal brought its own inefficiencies, the loss of economies of scale, the difficulty of transporting raw materials and finished products, the impossibility of maintaining quality control across dozens of improvised workshops. Steel production in the Ruhr fell by nearly half between March and September 1943. Tank production declined accordingly. The Wehrmacht began to experience critical shortages of ammunition and spare parts. The industrial heart of the Reich was failing. What haunted the German workers most was not the destruction itself, but the relentlessness of it. There was no respite, no mercy, no negotiation. The Americans came in daylight, the British came at night, and between them they gave the Ruhr no chance to heal. Every rebuilt factory became a target for the next raid. Every restored rail line was bombed again within weeks. The psychological toll was immense. Workers developed a particular kind of fatalism, what one survivor later described as the machine consciousness, the understanding that they were caught between two vast industrial systems, German and American, and that their individual survival was purely a matter of chance. You could follow every air raid procedure perfectly, take shelter in the deepest bunker, do everything right, and still die if a 2,000-pound bomb happened to land on your building. Or you could be careless, ignore the sirens, and survive because the bombs fell 2 streets over. There was no pattern, no justice, only probability and high explosives. The symbolic object that came to represent American abundance to the people of the Ruhr was not a weapon or a luxury item, but something far more mundane, aluminum. Every downed B-17 was a treasure trove of the stuff, thousands of pounds of high-grade aluminum alloy, a material that had become desperately scarce in Germany as industrial capacity declined. Scavengers would rush to crash sites, sometimes while the wreckage was still burning, to strip away pieces of aircraft skin, engine cowlings, anything that could be recycled. The contrast was inescapable. The Americans were building bombers so large, so heavy, so laden with equipment that each one contained more aluminum than a German fighter plane, and they were losing hundreds of these aircraft and simply building more. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. It forced a confrontation with reality that no amount of propaganda could disguise. The Americans had so much, and the Germans had so little, and the gap was growing wider with every passing month. By late 1943, some workers in the Ruhr had begun to quietly hope for Allied victory. This was not ideological conversion. Most remained German patriots who despised the Allied bombing of their homes, but rather a cold assessment that continued resistance would only bring more destruction. Better to lose the war quickly than to watch the entire Ruhr ground to dust in a prolonged struggle. Such thoughts were never spoken aloud, of course. The SS and Gestapo maintained brutal discipline, executing defeatists and saboteurs with public hangings. But the thoughts were there nonetheless, spreading like cracks through concrete, invisible until the structure begins to fail.
The Americans, meanwhile, refined their methods with each mission. They developed new tactics to suppress flak batteries, new formation techniques to maximize defensive firepower, new target identification methods to improve bombing accuracy. They brought in long-range fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, that could accompany the bombers deep into German territory and engage the Luftwaffe fighters that rose to intercept. The air war over the Ruhr became a clash of industrial systems, German production declining under relentless bombardment, American production accelerating with each month. It was a race the Germans could not win, and increasingly they knew it. The winter of 1943-44 brought a temporary reduction in raid frequency. Bad weather grounded many missions, but this was merely a pause, not a reprieve. When the spring weather cleared, the Americans returned with even larger formations, even heavier bomb loads. The 8th Air Force now had the strength to dispatch 1,000 bombers on a single mission, blanketing entire cities with high explosives and incendiaries. The Ruhr burned almost continuously during the spring of 1944. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft showed vast areas of industrial devastation, square miles of factories reduced to broken walls and twisted machinery. Alfred Krupp was arrested by American forces in April 1945, tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, and convicted. His factories lay in ruins, his workers scattered or dead, his dynasty's 400-year dominance of German industry ended. The Krupp works in Essen, once the pride of German engineering, had become a wasteland of shattered buildings and cold furnaces. American occupation forces surveyed the damage and were themselves amazed at the thoroughness of the destruction. A post-war analysis estimated that the combined British and American bombing campaign against the Ruhr had dropped more than 1 million tons of bombs on the region, killed over 50,000 workers and civilians, and reduced industrial capacity by approximately 70%. The cost to the Allies had been severe. Thousands of air crews killed, hundreds of millions of dollars in aircraft lost, but the strategic objective had been achieved. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany had been stopped. The epilogue to this campaign was written not in military dispatches, but in the silence of the cold furnaces. Heinrich Miller, the foreman who had witnessed that first raid in March 1943, survived the war. In the years that followed, he would sometimes return to the ruins of the Krupp works, walking through the empty buildings where he had once commanded hundreds of workers. The machinery was gone, hauled away as war reparations or scrapped for metal. The buildings themselves were just shells, their windows empty sockets staring at nothing. He never spoke much about what he had seen during those years, the raids, the fires, the bodies pulled from collapsed bunkers, but he kept a small piece of aluminum in his workshop, a fragment from a crashed B-17, twisted and scorched. When asked why, he would simply say it was a reminder that no industrial power, no matter how mighty, is invincible when faced with an enemy possessing greater resources and the will to use them without mercy. The story of the Ruhr is ultimately a story about the transformation of war itself. For centuries, warfare had been primarily a contest between armies on battlefields, with civilians affected but rarely targeted directly. The Industrial Revolution changed this calculation. When wars became industrial, when victory depended not just on the courage of soldiers, but on the output of factories, the factories themselves became battlefields. The workers became combatants, whether they wore uniforms or not. This was the dark logic that led to the skies over Essen filling with bombers, to the systematic destruction of entire industrial regions, to the death of tens of thousands of civilians in the name of strategic necessity.
The Americans who planned and executed these raids did not celebrate their work. They understood they had been forced to become destroyers, to participate in a form of warfare that blurred all the old distinctions between soldier and civilian, between battlefield and home front. But they also believed, with the fervent conviction of men who had seen the alternative, that defeating Nazi Germany required such measures. The factories of the Ruhr had built the tanks that crushed Poland, the artillery that shelled London, the ammunition that fueled the Holocaust. Destroying those factories was not vengeance, but necessity, a brutal calculation that saving future lives justified taking present ones. In the end, the Ruhr became a symbol of something larger than military strategy or industrial capacity. It represented the collision between two different visions of modernity, two different answers to the question of what industrial civilization could be used for. The Germans had built the Ruhr to project power, to dominate Europe, to feed an ideology of racial supremacy. The Americans had mobilized their own industrial capacity not to conquer, but to liberate, not to enslave, but to free. This was the deeper ideological contest beneath the tactical realities of the bombing campaign, a contest between oppression and democracy, between scarcity and abundance, between the closed fist of totalitarianism and the open hand of freedom. When the last bombs fell on the Ruhr in early 1945, they marked not just the end of German industrial power, but the end of an era. The age of European dominance was over. The new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, had been forged in the crucible of total war, and they possessed industrial capabilities that dwarfed anything Europe had ever achieved. The factories that once made the Ruhr the envy of the world were obsolete before they were destroyed, relics of a 19th century model of industrialization that could not compete with the vast, integrated production systems of the United States. Today, the Ruhr has been rebuilt, transformed from an industrial wasteland into a post-industrial landscape of museums, universities, and parks. The Krupp Works in Essen is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its preserved buildings standing as monuments to a vanished age. Visitors walk through the empty factory halls and try to imagine the noise, the heat, the terrible energy of a place that once produced the instruments of war on an almost unimaginable scale. They see the peaceful present and struggle to reconcile it with the violent past.
But the lesson of the Ruhr endures, carved not in stone, but in memory. It is a lesson about the terrible power of modern industry, about what happens when that power is marshaled for evil purposes, and about the even greater power required to stop it. It is a lesson about abundance and scarcity, about democracies that can outproduce dictatorships because their people work freely rather than in fear. It is a lesson about the moral complexities of total war, about the impossibility of keeping clean hands when fighting an enemy that has thrown away all moral constraints. The sky over the Ruhr is clear now, undisturbed by bombers or anti-aircraft fire. The silence where the furnaces once roared is complete. But if you listen carefully, in the wind that moves through the preserved factory buildings, you can still hear an echo of that night in March 1943,
The distant drone of approaching engines, the wail of sirens, the terrible certainty that the age of invulnerability was over, and that what was once claimed to be safe would be leveled, factory by factory, furnace by furnace, until nothing remained but ruins and the hard lessons written in their dust.